Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll be talking from an Indo-Pacific perspective. So I'm here to welcome my good friend and colleague back to Australia. Hi, Evan. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I think we're going to kick off with a bit of a casual chat about civil-military relations in the region. So just to warm up our audience, could you just give us a bit of an overview about what you think some of the major trends are with respect to civil-military relations in the Indo-Pacific or smaller than that?
Sure. I think there's a couple of interesting trends I'm looking out for the last couple of years. I think first, of course, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it's a huge region. It goes from the western coast of Africa all the way down to the Pacific. So regardless of your specific definition, my remarks are a bit more closer to maybe Southeast Asia and East Asia. But a couple of, I think, key trends. One, as we talked about earlier, I do think the nature of the geostrategic and geopolitical challenges now are increasingly complicated in a few different ways. Firstly, certainly the exclusionary tendencies of US-China competition, as in if you're part of one camp, it's harder to be a part of another. But on a military sense, the growth in partnership across the Indo-Pacific can be and will be, I think, part of that network polarity, that the more you exercise with one partner, there is a chance that the other partner may not be entirely excited about that part. So that's one aspect in which I think the competition at the geostrategic level affects the quality and depth of your defense partnerships. The second trend, I think, is a bit more closer to the domestic trend, which is despite the maritime nature, if you will, of geostrategic challenges in the Indo-Pacific, the role of the Army, particularly from Southeast Asia, has actually grown, perhaps, and not necessarily lessened. Now, of course, there's a whole debate about whether or not is there a role for armies in a future maritime conflict? What role should the Navy and Air Force play in developing anti-access strategies, for example? So there's a lot of these conceptual debates about the proper strategic posture and outlook. But for Southeast Asian states, regardless of the debate, the answer is more army. The answer is strengthening domestic resilience, an idea that's not new. Domestic resilience has been around the lexicon of Southeast Asian military since the 1960s and 70s. In fact, the phrase regional resilience, in which it is the sum of all domestic resilience in Southeast Asia, is something that Indonesia has put forward since the 1970s. And so in that sense, it's almost a familiar reach to a bygone era where domestic resilience means the dominant role of the Army from as wide range as policy, from health sector to education to governance, all the way down to defense policy. In an interesting paradox, does that lead to a more stable environment because the militaries are not competitive posture in an external sense of the word, that the Army actually brings the posture more inward? Is that necessarily a bad thing from a geopolitical tension standpoint? Or should we actually put forward a much more externally oriented defensive posture if issues like the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait or the Korean Peninsula becomes much more of a strategic concern? That, I think, is still the ongoing debate. And lastly, I think what is also interesting is the role of technology and how that shapes civil military relations as well. Because a part of the reason why in places like Southeast Asia, the Army was so dominant in political and policy life was because there was this perception that the civilians actually were less capable at handling major governance issues. Although at the time, I think in the case of Indonesia at least, there was some realization that the country could not be governed without technocratic expertise. So right now, whether or not the role of technology actually empowers some of the civilian side of the house, whether or not the best and brightest of the society no longer choose to go to the military and choose to go to civilian universities, there are long structural changes, I think, that changes the intellectual, the strategic, and the organizational posture of militaries across Southeast Asia. All of this is happening, I think, at a time when the fundamental threat diversity in the region has not changed. We've heard in the last few years that there is a single threat vector, that it's all about China for some countries. But for many in the region, that single threat vector is not just unrealistic, but also unsustainable. From an operational day-to-day standpoint, the challenges of transnational crime, from illegal fishing to scam centers to simple operational presence, remain an ever-changing challenge, let alone having the bandwidth to deal with major strategic challenges like the South China Sea. So this push and pull between the changes in the regional environment, the changes in the domestic foundations of civil-military relations, as well as the growth in threat diversity, I think makes the region particularly complex, and that easy, cookie-cutter solutions to civil-military relations, I'm afraid, don't really exist for many in the region.
All right, so if they don't really exist in the region, though, we still have to be able to talk about them in many ways. We are in the throes of many states that have newly democratized in the last couple of decades that have had to renegotiate the fundamental role of the army in particular in midst of the state and its relationship to society. I just want to unpack the tension that you talked about just now, because in the earlier remarks on your panel, you talked about a mature Southeast Asian state, militarization without politicization, and perhaps a happier state of affairs being a lessened army role in the state and perhaps in society. But on the other hand, you've talked about the necessity in certain states, either due to societal levels of trust and support for the armed forces, particularly in Indonesia, the idea of the People's Army, or in the Philippines as well, and their role in disaster relief and health services, but also the need to kind of strike this balance. How do we negotiate that? How do we talk about civil-military relations in these kinds of states where there is this tension, where people want the army there, but it is a drain on resources, a drain on the defense budget? And to add further to that, how do we talk about civil-military relations in these countries in our nearest region, which is of immense strategic importance to Australia, without using the language of democracy? Because it is anathema to a lot of leaders in the region that they are semi-democratic states, or states that are declining in democratic status. I'm thinking here of Thailand, amongst others. How do we talk about this just as scholars, but then how do we also talk about this and support democratic values as practitioners?
So I think there's a couple of different threats there, which I think is sort of more generic across different parts of Southeast Asia. First is the notion of the military, or in our conversation case, I guess, the Army's sort of corporate interests. These are what is often seen as the internal interest of the military institutions, whether it's defense budgeting, personnel, posture development, doctrinal concepts. These are things that are often seen as untouchable areas by civilian oversight, because the militaries feel the civilians don't have the expertise to talk about these internal corporate interests of ours. And I think for a long time, many parts of Southeast Asia was, I wouldn't say happy, but sort of tolerant of that, I guess, somewhat division of a labor. Fine, the civilian elected leaders, parliament, civil society can talk about defense budgeting and strategic outlook, but when it comes to actually executing policy, developing policies, doctrinal issues, how to spend the money, how we do operations, all of that is the internal autonomy of the armed forces. And so this dance between providing a certain degree of autonomy so that there is no pushback from the military versus the degree of civil oversight, I think, has always been a difficult balance for many in Southeast Asia. What I think is challenging moving forward is whether or not, number one, will the civilian leadership, not just the elected leaders and the executive, but also the political parties, will they have the necessary expertise to provide detailed policy expertise and oversight over the armed forces, so that when the military says, I need so-and-so $1 billion to buy X, Y, and Z, the civilian side of the house can actually say, well, actually, you don't need X, Y, and Z. You need A, B, C. That kind of conversation rarely happens, I think, in Southeast Asia. So the expertise on the civilian side, I think, is crucial. The second part on the military itself, in fact, one way to talk about military reform in parts of Southeast Asia that does not invoke a normative ideal of a liberal democracy is military effectiveness. That the need to have strong civilian defense community provides a reality check, provides a ballast for what the military might think about the region. They don't have the expertise to understand different regional securities and polities and challenges. So having a strong civil defense community can help in that sense. Issues of defense procurement, in Southeast Asia, a lot of the defense establishment at the ministry side are often military people, and which means they get rotated quite quickly. There's no set a civilian core that can provide details around defense procurement, scenario planning, strategic assessment. These are things that are more readily found if there was a strong civil defense community on the civilian side. And so it isn't about necessarily democratic ideals. Of course, that's something that's in the back of our heads, but convincing the military that the involvement and the strength of the civil defense community, the oversight provided by the political leadership, is all geared towards making the military more professional. In the case of Indonesia, one of the key ways in which you address this was actually, again, to go back to the 1980s, what Benny Murdani used to say as having the Indonesian military small, effective, and efficient. So it's not the size that matters. It's not growing the number of army officers. It's using the money that you save from reducing the armed forces into technology, into education and training. Improving the quality of the officers, he used to say, is the ultimate deterrence for Indonesia. If Indonesia can buy 50 advanced tank and fighter jets, but the quality of its officers are not up to par to its regional counterparts, that's a challenge. And I think he had it right in terms of instincts for a country as big as Indonesia. So I understand that my friends in civil society would argue it is about democracy, it is about human rights, it is about liberal values, and that's fine. And I think in a healthy civil society, they should have those views articulated. But for the civilian defense community, I think they also need to know how to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the armed forces as a whole. And that includes having the expertise on technocratic stuff like how do you do defense planning for a life cycle cost of a particular hardware? How do you think about offset policy? How do you provide an alternative? If you say that the territorial command structure is politically contentious, what's the alternative to a territorial command structure? Is there a role for the police? So there are these policy debates that I think remains unresolved precisely because it starts with a contentious normative debates about democracy when in fact the framework of military effectiveness is actually a lot more useful to think about, do you exercise regularly enough across the services? Do you do more training related to the scenarios that you want to actually develop? And I think this is where the militarization in the professional sense of the word is necessary, because one thing that Indonesia did right in the early 2000s was the effort to depoliticize the armed forces. But that wasn't followed by the remilitarization of the armed forces in a professional sense. So that's why I said the trend may be across Southeast Asia, not just Indonesia, if you actually do have less political militaries and more professional armed forces, not just in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, but also the ability to engage each other and maintain strategic stability is not an insignificant value, I think, of that process.
Fair enough. I mean, you're currently based in Singapore. You've spent a lot of time around other Southeast Asian militaries. I want to shift the gaze, actually, rather than look at Southeast Asian militaries. Could you share what some of the views are of the Australian Army? So I just want to ask two quick questions for this before we open up to the audience. The first is, how do our regional counterparts view the Australian Army? What is expected of it? And what could the Army do better? And last but not least, on a practical note, what do you think an Army officer or soldier should know when going to engage with TNI or other regional militaries?
That's a very difficult question because I wish there was actual systematic data to help me assess the views of the Australian Army. So what I can share is perhaps more somewhat anecdotal and impressionistic as opposed to based on a solid survey data. I think certainly if I go around the region, I'm 90% sure more than half of the officers in Southeast Asia are trained in Australia one way or the other. So Australia is a strong provider of education and training programs for many, I would say in the thousands of Southeast Asian officers. I would say US and Australia would be my top two a kind of provider of education and training programs over the last 4 or 5 decades. So that impression of the Australian Army as a place where you go to be better educated, to build network with regional counterparts is certainly there. Of course, that includes exercise partners as well. So that part, I think, is certainly clear. Is the Australian Army seen as a provider of technological capabilities? Maybe not. And that's okay. I think the people-to-people strength that's provided by the plethora of PME courses and programs by Australia is an underlying strategic capital. Now, whether or not that's only the value of PME, which is to have access and influence, or is that going to be multiplied into the professionalization of the Southeast Asian Armed Forces is a different question. You have the network, you have the access, you have the influence, but whether or not the Southeast Asian Armed Forces become like Australia, that's a different question. And this is where I think, to your second question, the history and the intricacies of the domestic civil-military relations of the different Southeast Asian states, the detailed organizational policy challenges faced by Southeast Asian states, I think provides a filter to potential professionalization of Southeast Asian Armed Forces through education and training programs with Australia. So I think in that sense, the expectation is certainly that Australia is a strong partner. Maybe there's a different expectation when it comes to operational challenges, because I do think Southeast Asian states ultimately also realize that Australia has alliance obligations, that Australia has different strategic outlook than them, and that Australia has different concerns. Now, some of those security interests and challenges are convergent, from illegal fishing to people smuggling, sure. But is it convergent on South China Sea and China? It's up for debate. Is it convergent on issues of insurgency and internal security? I think also up for debate. So the expectation, I think, certainly is Australia is a strong partner, strong provider of soft power or human capital in terms of education, training, and exercise. I don't think there's an expectation necessarily that there's going to be joint warfighting experience as part of that expectation, given the different strategic outlooks. And this is where I think thinking through about the internal military policies and challenges is critical. So one small example based on that for me, I would sort of look at personnel management. I think personnel management is a key underappreciated challenge for Southeast Asian militaries. Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia to some extent, Vietnam certainly. The size of the army, the need to maintain a competitive career without what is known as an inflation of generals, where you have too many generals but not enough jobs around. This creates all kinds of challenges for the armed forces, in which issues like strategic changes, defense planning, assessment, these are all tied to careerism within the military, which presents its own challenges. So I do think understanding the culture and all of that is great, and that's necessary. Understanding the operational history of the different armed forces in Southeast Asia is crucial, but ultimately, understanding the people and their day-to-day challenges, in which a lot of them is about their careers and personnel management, is also important. But that's sort of where I'm coming from, where I think of the challenges less about not enough money or hardware, but it stems from the organizational challenges and personnel management.
All right, thanks, Evan. I think I'm done grilling you for now. I think I'm going to open it up to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 roving mics, so please put up your hand, or you can populate the app for the questions as well. Do I have a volunteer for the first question? So I don't have any questions coming up on my app yet. Oh, wait. Yep.
Hello, Evan. My name's John Oddy. I was the first military commander of the response to the Banda Aceh tsunami. To get into Indonesia and to lead that response was an interesting journey on the way over. I saw that for our mission to work, our relationship had to be founded on a deep trust in the Indonesian military to deliver that outcome and to provide the key to the door to go and do the things that mattered. To do so, we were actually able to get through customs and immigration without any passports or anything, which in my view is pretty remarkable. And then having got up there on the first day after the tsunami, we met with the staff there in General Bambang Darmiri's office, and then the next day met with General Bambang Darmono. And the general principle that we took was our best weapon was our smile, our commitment to Indonesia through, as represented by the Indonesian military, was the pathway to success. And it was my view as the commander that respecting the Indonesian military in that social leadership role was an essential pathway to mission success. I'd just like to understand, I've only ever had my views about this, do you have any views about that general strategy of engagement and how we went forward in the day? Thank you.
That's a very difficult question, but I do think it's an important one. I think certainly Indonesian officers during moments of crisis versus non-crisis kind of carries themselves in different ways because there are different priorities, obviously. So there is that bit as a caveat that how you deal with the Indonesian military during crisis and non-crisis situations are actually quite different. But that aside, I do think when it comes to strategic engagement, certainly what Australia has been doing in terms of education and training program and exercises has been quite successful, and dare I say perhaps the most successful part of the defense relationship. Now, the expectation, however, is that it stays within a defense relationship. To expect that it will spill over into political, diplomatic, economic is perhaps unrealistic. And so as long as the management of expectation is within that domain, that defense relationship is good for defense-specific context and not about US-China competition, not about diplomatic and all of that, I think that's where things tend to be complicated, because I do think the Indonesian military has a pretty ingrained sense of non-alignment, if you will. They have concerns about the geography in which both north, south, east, and west are all porous. And so the presence of engagement does not negate challenges. And so the trust that Australia has built with Indonesia can always be rocked by political issues, economic challenges, and that's okay. In fact, in some cases, I would argue the reverse can be true precisely because things are so good that at times of crisis, it can be seen as expendable. And that's not always a good thing. I think Indonesia, quite frankly, also hasn't devoted enough attention to understanding Australia as much as the reverse. I think there's a lot more appetite from Australia to understand Indonesia than the other way around. And that's not a healthy position to be in as well. So I would argue that defense engagement provides an important baseline. But the challenge is, number one, from the Indonesia side, is there a strategic framework for defense diplomacy in general, in which there is somewhat of a functional differentiation? Okay, with Australia, we do X, Y, and Z exercises in education. With country X, we do something else. With country B, we do something else. And there's a strategic framework because we try to develop certain capabilities in a particular way. So that type of strategic framework for defense diplomacy is something that Indonesia, I think, has to work out. From the Australian side, I think it is quite interesting because, number one, I don't think the history will go away about Timor and all of those things. We're not saying that it colors the day-to-day perception, but it does color how Indonesian military views the region. And there's going to be moments of convergence and there'll be moments of divergence, and that's okay. The idea of threat coming through or from Indonesia is still part of the strategic discourse in Australia, and it's not necessarily reflective of intent or anything like that, but it's just the strategic reality. The same thing with Indonesia. The sense of encirclement out of a porous geographic situation is also inherent in that outlook. So the point, I think, for me is that when there are moments of divergence, particularly between Australia and the United States, the challenge isn't Australia, US, and China. It's actually Australia, US, and Indonesia. And there are times when how the Indonesian military views the US can affect how Indonesia views Australia. And that's just the way that goes. But the point being is that that doesn't mean the defense engagement should be lessened. It just means that it has to be more purposeful, and it has to be driven by a careful set of managing expectations from both sides, at the political level as well as at the defense level. But so far, to be honest, of all the regional defense partnerships that Indonesia has, Australia is pretty strong on that defense relationship.
Actually, it's appropriate that we're in the Australian War Memorial to bring up the idea of national memory. I think you and I both know from our research that East Timor still looms large in the memory of TNI officers as well, so that's perhaps something else to note as well. I'm going to throw now to some of the questions online. One question I've got is the profession of arms a useful commonality between the Australian Army and regional armies, or are we all too different?
That's a little bit challenging because the definition of profession of arms is not the same, I think, in Australia compared to places like Indonesia. The way that the history is taught in Indonesia, for example, the profession of arms means you play a role beyond military because you help found the republic, you defend the republic, and therefore you have to protect the republic in its broad terms. So the profession of arms for a long time in Indonesian military was the ability to play a military role, sure, but also a non-military role, which means you have to be good farmers, you have to be a good policy manager, you have to learn how to govern your relationship with the local labor union, you have to run local provinces. And that, I think, is a little bit making a comeback, I think, in Indonesia for different reasons than the 1960s. But the definition of the profession of arms cannot be separated, I think, from the social and political history of the country. And in this case, I don't think the history of Australian profession of arms is necessarily convergent on the key points. Of course, at the heart of it, are there things that are core to the profession of arms in terms of training, education, in terms of exercises, readiness, the application or the use of violence? Of course, that part for sure. But it's only one part of the professional side of expertise in the management of violence. The other part for the Indonesian military is the expertise in the use of non-military activities. And this is something that's inherent in the Indonesian military. And dare I say, it's also inherent in many other militaries in Southeast Asia. So this is why it's a counterfactual question to ask, can Southeast Asian states grow and mature and be governed sans the military, outside of the military, without the military? And nobody wants to answer that question because it's inherently risky and dare I say, a speculative proposition that could create all kinds of domestic challenges. So for me, at the most basic level, when it comes to profession of arms, sure, there are things that would be useful. As I said, doing PMEs in Australia and vice versa in Indonesia, you see commonalities, you see problem-solving outlook and all of that, the need to have doctrine and training and readiness, etc. But the other half is something that I think would create more challenges when it comes to the role of the army writ large. And I'm not entirely convinced that we can, in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, that there is a way for you to say 100% that the profession of arms for South Asian military has to be like the way Australia or other advanced democracies should be, as in separate and no longer thinking about economic growth, farming, food resilience. That seems a bit difficult, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I just want to throw out another concept to build on what you talked about just now, about the important distinction between Southeast Asian militaries and other militaries in the region and the heritage of the Australian Army in particular. And that's because a lot of the regional militaries have been raised from a guerrilla warfare, basically, from insurgencies. So they have an inextricable link with the society in ways that are similar to but fundamentally different from the way in which Australian society and army grew together throughout the First and Second World War experiences. And what that has left is this idea within Southeast Asian militaries, and even in the Pacific, that these armies are guardians of the nation. And if you think about it in those terms, there is a fundamentally different sense of responsibility and permission to enter into state affairs because of this DNA and this historical legacy. So I just wanted to add that extra bit. So I'm going to turn to one more question from the audience. Do I have anyone else who wants to pose a question to Dr. Laksmana?
Hello, Corporal Spence, AWSU Horsham. The question is, noting that Australia believes one of its next conflicts could be around China, if Australia was to establish a larger presence within the countries from the Indo-Pacific region, how do you believe these countries would react to that larger presence?
That's a good question, because we know the answer if it's an American presence. Australia is an interesting one. I guess let me tie that to my reaction to what Nat just said about the history of insurgency. As I was listening to Peter's lecture this morning about citizen army and all of that, I sort of felt that's sort of a similar story for the first part of the nation building and state building for Southeast Asia. But somewhere along the way, the insurgents, which is the guerrilla warfares, the militias during independence for many in Southeast Asia, became the counterinsurgent. There's a transition there in which they started out as a people's army and they became fighting their own people because of internal security challenges. So I think that's where the need to be embedded in society grows. And this is relevant for that question around security footprint. I think there's a few different levels to that question. From a diplomatic standpoint, whether or not that move to enlarge Australian footprint, is it Australians or is it Americans who are driving that policy, will be part of the question. And for a long time, there's always the struggle to balance Australia's autonomy versus Australia's need to maintain the alliance with the United States. And that's how Southeast Asia sees it too. I think there's a reason why the old stereotype about the deputy sheriff is still talked about. So that's one question on the diplomatic level. Second, is it really just about China? And if it is, how are you going to convince the rest of the region who don't see China as the primary vector of threat agree to that proposition? So if the framing for the enlargement of presence is purely, let me help you fight China, the next response would be, but what if we don't want to fight China? So the framing for such enlarged presence, I think, would have to be more than just China. I think it's not a winning proposition if you go around Southeast Asia saying, let me help you fight China. Also, this notion that going around Southeast Asia and say, surely if we tell you more about how threatening China is, surely you'll agree with us. That's kind of a non-starter. I don't think you should tell the Vietnamese who's dealt with China for 1,000 years how China is a challenge. So the framing, I think, is a second level problem. The third one, I think, is more logistical. When it comes to hardware, most Southeast Asian states are diverse in their hardware. Indonesia has 33, 34 foreign suppliers of hardware. Interoperability is going to be a huge challenge. Now, short of Australia only using a location or presence or access only for maintenance or logistics as opposed to joint interoperability, I'm not even sure how that's going to be of military value for the Southeast Asian states. So again, the notion of enlarging presence and more partnerships, that alone, I think, is already sufficiently important to grow. More access agreements, more exercises, more training, absolutely. But as I said earlier, if you take the next step and say, let me have a military base and a treaty alliance so that we can fight China together, that seems a bridge too far for me. So again, this doesn't preclude strong defense and security cooperation, but in that direction of travel, I think it will be quite challenging.
That's great. Look, I think we've just finished on time. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank Dr. Laksmana.